today we are talking about FedRAMP pre-authorization. So what is FedRAMP? What does it do? And why is it important? So FedRAMP is the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, and it consists of the JAB path and the agency path. So for the JAB path, like a lot of people ask, who is the JAB? What's the criteria that they use, and how do they evaluate who's going to be accepted on that path? So the JAB consists of CIOs from the DoD, DHS, and the GSA. And they have the demand for the CSP product as their first criteria that they utilize to evaluate CSP, whether a CSP is FedRAMP ready or not. And then they have some preferred characteristics as well that they use to evaluate CSPs based on whether they want to work with them or not. So their business case methodology consists of the initial review is based on demand. And it's important to note that that demand definitely is more so from the current federal customers being more valuable, so it's more weighed heavily in that aspect than the demand from non-federal customers or potential customers. If two CSPs are very similar on the demand scale, then they're evaluated on their FedRAMP ready status. And if the demand and the FedRAMP ready status are determined to be equal, then they are evaluated on the JAB preferred characteristics, which consists of whether they're designated for federal government, if they have a proven track record for management of risk and security implementations, and then if they provide heightened security so that it's less risk for the federal information that they're transferring, processing, and all that, and as well as whether they meet the federal government needs. So why is FedRAMP important? FedRAMP ensures adequate safeguards are in place for cloud-based services, and it also eliminates the duplication of effort for assessing those security controls. And that duplication of effort, it's important to note, is also on the agency side as much as it is on the CSP side. It reduces risk management costs by eliminating the duplication of effort and enables rapid and cost-effective procurement of systems and services. And in 2024, this year, the GAO came out with a report and they pulled 24 agencies. So in July 2019, they had like 926 ATOs utilized. And as of April 2023, they're at about 1,400. And it is important to also note that if you go on FedRAMP Marketplace, you're not going to see 1,400 ATOs. That is the reuse of the ATOs. So you can see that that's happening. So FedRAMP benefits, they have a do once, use many times framework. So it eliminates the duplication of effort for assessment, it lowers the cost for the government and the CSPs, and it ensures consistent application of security requirements, mainly the federal security requirements. And so in 2023, the GSA and OMB established a process for monitoring agency compliance with FedRAMP. And so it's becoming more prevalent nowadays. Sure.
Is that, do once too many times, is that across not just the federal government, but also DoD?
Yes, that's correct. They also have, the DoD also has their own program where they have their own cloud authorization as well as managed by DISA as well. So they recognize the FedRAMP authorizations. Yep. So they have something called the Cloud Security Catalog. If you're on the FedRAMP Marketplace, you automatically get on their cloud security catalog. If you're at the moderate, you get at IL2, et cetera. All right. So how do organizations go about obtaining a FedRAMP authority to operate and maintaining that authorization? There are 6 key phases. The first being to prepare your organization, to understand your offering, and then to categorize your system. So the first thing that you want to do when you're preparing your organization is make sure you get executive buy-in, right? It's important that the executives understand, not only the executives, but also all the stakeholders who are going to be working on the FedRAMP initiative, that they understand that FedRAMP takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. So you really have to understand what the timelines are, and we'll talk about that as we move through the next few phases as well. It also costs quite a bit of money, right? There are costs associated with tools. You have your assessment team, if you need an advisory firm, you cost of personnel who are going to work on the FedRAMP initiative as well. And also, FedRAMP just is not an easy lift, right? A lot of executives think, oh, we got SOC 2 in this amount of time, and that was relatively easy. FedRAMP is fairly wide when it comes to cybersecurity and all the different domains that it touches on, and it goes very deep as well. So it's really important to know that it is not easy, but it is definitely doable. Even small CSPs are able to achieve FedRAMP if you take the appropriate steps to get there. So once you've gotten your executive buy-in, it's really important to take a look at the resources that you have within your organization, right? Do you have the resources that you can allocate? If you're a SaaS provider, do you have developers who are going to be able to work on the application and enhance the application in order to meet FedRAMP requirements? Do you have the infrastructure personnel who are going to be able to build or remediate and configure the infrastructure to deliver a FedRAMP compliant solution? You have personnel who are going to be able to work on all the documentation and execute all of these key processes, right? The next important step is to really understand where you have gaps in your organization. Do you need to bring in and hire folks who have FedRAMP experience to help you get to that finish line? Do you want to bring on an advisory firm who's going to be able to provide you with that expertise and help you obtain a FedRAMP ATO and implement all of the required controls? You need an engineering firm who's going to augment your team and help them build a compliant solution. So it's really important to understand where you need to fill in those gaps. Now, once you've prepared your organization, it's really important that you understand what your offering is going to be, right? Are you going to be offering your commercial customers the exact same solution that you offer your government customers the same solution that you offer to the commercial sector, right? Is it going to be in the same environment? Are we going to set up a government-only instance? Does your government customer only care for a subset of capabilities that you're currently providing, or are you going to provide something unique to them? So it's really important to understand what it is that you're going to offer. Now, at this point, you're going to want to go through something called the system categorization. And really what that is to understand all the data types that your information system is going to process, store, and transmit when it comes to federal agencies, right? There's a NIST special publication, NIST 860, that has a full catalog of all of the different data types. And you'll go through that catalog and pick out all the different data types that you'll process, store, and transmit. And this will really drive whether you're going to go after, a low baseline or FedRAMP moderate, FedRAMP high, et cetera. So it's really important to understand those types. At this point, you're going to want to define your system boundary. Now, I use the word define very loosely. A lot of organizations think that they can just draw a box around a few servers, maybe a few databases, and say that this is the only thing that's in scope of FedRAMP. However, it doesn't work that way. You don't actually get to pick your system boundary, rather the boundary picks you. Now, what do I mean by that? The way I try to explain it to our customers is, imagine an agency sends you a packet of data, and that data leaves their secure network and lands in your system and in your network. Anywhere where that data flows through your system and your network is within scope of FedRAMP. It is a part of your system boundary. If it goes through a virtual firewall, your virtual machines, a web server, on your database, all of that is in scope of FedRAMP. So it's really important to understand what your boundary is, because that's where you're going to have to apply all of your security controls where those controls are applicable, right? At this point, you're going to move on to selecting and tailoring security controls. Now, if you have a sponsor, it is a great idea to get them involved and on the same page and in agreement with your security categorization, right? Whether you're going to be a low, a moderate, or a high. A lot of times they may have some different ideas in mind. You might have come out as a FedRAMP moderate, but they want to put more sensitive data in your system, so they might ask you to upgrade to high, et cetera. It's also important to understand if your customer has any unique requirements. A lot of times they might be okay with your system categorization, but they might ask you to add a few additional controls, or they might have certain parameters that they want you to meet when implementing some of these controls. So it's really important that you understand your customer's requirements. Once you've categorized the system, once you've understood your system requirements, it's time to do a gap analysis, right? Now, the gap analysis, what we've seen is there are multiple different kinds, right? We've seen a gap analysis that's, 25 to 30 controls. And a lot of times that's great for some larger CSPs that have a huge security budget, have a great mature security program, and just in general are advanced when it comes to security, right? But for some smaller CSPs, we find that that's just not good enough, because in a moderate baseline, there's 323 controls, right? So it'd be great to go into an assessment and not have any of those critical or high findings, but there are a lot of controls that you haven't touched on yet, and you don't want to come out of an assessment with 100, 150 controls that failed. That might put your sponsor off a little bit, and they may hesitate to either give you an ATO, or at least they may hesitate to do it without any conditions. So it's really important that you do a thorough gap analysis, right? What we typically recommend is to include the 6 larger families. So the 4 technical ones, we have AC, which is access control, identification, authentication. You're going to want to review your audit and accountability controls. So that talks about, what audit logs you're collecting, are you monitoring for suspicious and inappropriate activities, et cetera. You have system and communication protection, which deals a lot with boundary protection and encryption, configuration management, and then system and information integrity, which also includes some elements of vulnerability management. And the other type of gap analysis that we've seen is a full gap analysis of all controls, which is, obviously great as well. Excuse me.
And it's also important to have like the key mandates being addressed in that gap analysis, as well as ensuring that your technical team that's actually going to be implementing it is sitting in that gap analysis.
Yep.
Because if they don't fully understand the reason why they're implementing a control, they're going to give more pushback. But if they're in that meeting, they tend to be like, oh, that makes sense.
Exactly. And really that gap analysis time really also should serve as a workshop. Especially if you're using an advisory firm who's done this before, they should be able to tell you, hey, here are the 5 ways that we've seen this, and this is why this control is important, and this is how your assessor is going to be looking at this control. So they're really going to be able to prepare you a little bit better, and your engineers will have a thorough understanding of everything so that they're implementing all the controls and thinking about all of the requirements that they have to implement as they're building this system. So that's a great point. So the other important thing when it comes to the gap analysis is to make sure that the data that you get out of that gap analysis provides your engineers and your technical team with enough data so that they are empowered to go correct the issue or go build a compliant solution. So the recommendations coming out of that gap analysis really have to be thorough and really have to give them insights on how to actually fix the issue or build it properly if they're building a brand new instance. One thing to note is when you do define your system boundary in the first phase, as you're going through the next 2 phases, you'll find that it's going to change, right? Your current system boundary right now is the system that you have in place. And that serves as a great reference point for the next 2 phases. But as you find that things need to be fixed, things need to be changed, you may not be using some of those cloud interconnections, et cetera, your system boundary is going to change. And that's okay. And that's what we've seen 95% of the time happen. So your system boundary will change. And as it continues to change, if you have a sponsor, it's always great to update them and say, hey, based on the gap analysis that we did, based on some additional advisory information that we got, here is how we're changing our system boundary to be compliant. So that's okay if things like that change as you go along, right? Once you get to some of the further steps, you probably don't want to change the boundary, but sometimes that happens as well. So now that you've completed your gap analysis, it's time for your team to take a look at the architecture, and really take a step back and design a system that is going to be compliant. I would not have the engineers just go take the information of the recommendation and start trying to fix things. Rather, take a step back and architect a solution that is going to be compliant. One of the biggest pitfalls that I see in this phase is that organizations don't really have a full understanding of how their system interacts with other systems and what interconnections they have, right? If you're interconnecting with other clouds, they should be FedRAMP authorized. If not, your agency sponsor should be okay with it. So ideally, you're working with them at this point. But more importantly, and we've seen this before, a lot of organizations end up pulling items into the boundary that should not be in the boundary, right? They'll interconnect with their corporate environment, and the last thing that you want to do is to bring a corporate environment or another environment that you have into scope. So you really have to make sure you are appropriately segmenting this environment so that you avoid any scope creep during the assessment and the authorization process. So now that your team has designed an architecture that's going to be compliant for FedRAMP, and they have the information that they need from the gap analysis to go implement security controls, it's time to develop the FedRAMP package, right? The FedRAMP package, for those of you who may not have seen it before or unfamiliar with the FedRAMP package, it is a very large amount of documentation. The system security plan itself is anywhere between 600 and 1,000 pages, and it could be even more depending on how complex your offering is. And it's really important that you write clear and concise implementation statements so that anybody doing the review, whether it be an agency sponsor, agencies that are going to use your system in the future, the FedRAMP PMO, it's very clear to them on how you implement those controls, but also what customer responsibilities they have. And that's going to be something that we talk about in a little bit as well, but they need to know what their customer responsibilities are as well. So that's just one document. You've got to create policies, procedures for all of the different control families. You have additional plans like the incident response plan, a configuration management plan, the continuous monitoring plan, and a few others as well. And so you'll find there are a lot of documents that have to be developed. So it's really important that you have folks who are able to dedicate the time to either develop the documentation or bring on a firm who's done it so that they can come in and develop that documentation on your behalf.
And I would say it's really important, really vital to get your technical team to actually sit down and review those documents, because if they're not right, like the first thing that's going to happen during an assessment or an audit is you're going to be asked for all your documentation. And if you're not doing something that your documentation says you're doing, you're going to have findings.
That's absolutely right. The first thing that we do as a 3PAO when we're assessing controls is we're going to read the policy for that control, we're going to read the procedure for that control, and we're going to read the implementation statements associated with that control and basically say, okay, you say you're doing these things, give me the evidence to prove it, and then they're going to go conduct their evidence, right? So if you've written something down that sounds like it's a great process, really hard to live up to, but it sounds like it's a great policy and procedure, but you can't prove that you're doing it, that becomes an issue for you guys, right? So it's really important that you have accurate documentation and that anybody who's involved in delivering on those controls has put their eyes on that documentation and approved it and says, yep, that's exactly what we're doing, and that's how we're going to be doing it in the future. So as the FedRAMP package is being developed, it's time to also work with technical teams, management teams, and operational teams, and make sure that you're working on any process improvements that have to be made. You may have to create a new process. You may have to improve current processes that you have in place. You may have to remove a process, right? So it's really important that anybody who's going to be involved in executing any of these processes is prepared to execute those processes, right? And understands what it is that they have to do consistently over time, right? This isn't a one and done thing. Let me do this once or twice. We can use that evidence and we're good to go. Rather, you're going to have to continually show that this is being done, because your 3PAO assessors will have a sampling methodology, right? And every year, anything that's happened over the past 12 months is fair game for the assessment. right? So if you onboard 20 staff, 30 staff, you only follow the process for 2 or 3, well, they're going to be doing some sampling. And so they'll probably find that you weren't following your processes there if that's not what you're doing consistently. So once you have your processes implemented, once the technical team says, hey, we've developed everything, we're good to go, and once all the documentation has been completed, you're probably about ready to move on to the next process. The one thing that I'll say in this phase that is critical is to make sure that you have very good project management practices in place. Right? It's really important that we're able to track all of the different moving parts across all of the different teams and ensure that everything is getting to the finish line, right? Now, once you're done with this phase, this is probably a good place to take a little break and take a step back.
Yeah, and I would recommend like start prioritizing. Like one of the greatest pitfalls that we see during assessments is client getting in and they're not able to produce timely artifacts and they're not able to produce them at the rate that we need them provided. So having strategy early on and saying, okay, for this control, we're going to produce this list of artifacts. And for this control, we have these artifacts, and kind of tying those together early on is going to be really beneficial so that you can get the turnaround during assessment.
Yeah, the more you prepare for the assessment, the better off you are, the more efficient it will be. And at the end of the day, if you're organized and you're able to get through the assessment quickly, that'll probably help reduce costs in general to your organization. So at this point, I say taking a break, but really it's taking a step back to really make sure you're prepared. There's 2 things that I always recommend that an organization does. The first is to download the readiness assessment report from the FedRAMP marketplace, right? Before you go into an assessment, whether you're going to do a readiness assessment or a full assessment, download that assessment report and review all of the controls that are in the readiness assessment template and start going through each one. Can you check the box that you have those controls appropriately implemented? Right? When you start the assessment, there's going to be costs incurred with your 3PAO. So it's just better to make sure that you're comfortable and that you understand the critical controls, the more important controls, the more difficult controls to implement in that readiness assessment. You're better off if you can check all of those boxes yes before you call your 3PAO. The other important thing to do at this stage is to make sure that you're executing your continuous monitoring plan. When your 3PAO comes in to conduct the assessment, they're going to ask you to draw a line in the sand. At what date are you saying all of the controls have been implemented, and going forward, we are executing all of our continuous monitoring requirements and all the controls are working as they are intended? From that date, you'll need to be able to produce artifacts to show that you are following all of your processes and executing all of your continuous monitoring controls. Depending on the 3PAO that you pick and depending on whether you're doing a readiness assessment or a full assessment, you may have to produce 1 to 3 months worth of continuous monitoring assessment artifacts, right? I always recommend talk to your 3PAO about this early on. Once you have that done, you're probably ready to move to the assessment phase. Now, when identifying a 3PAO, I highly recommend, and I cannot stress this enough, to identify your 3PAO as early in the process as you can. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first being, every CSP is different. You might run into unique situations, and you may have questions about how a controller is going to be assessed given that unique situation, right? So it'd be great if you could touch base with your 3PAO. They're not going to tell you how to implement it, right? They have to maintain their independence, but they will be able to tell you how they would approach the assessment of that control given your unique situation. So it's the more help you can get throughout the process, the better off you are. The other reason why you want to identify a 3PAO early is because most resources at 3PAOs are being booked 4 to 6 months in advance, right? So if you get to this phase and you say, all right, I'm ready to go find a 3PAO, you might identify a few that you really like and you really want to work with, but you probably can't start the assessment for another 4 to 6 months at the earliest, right? So the earlier you can identify them, the earlier you have conversations with these 3PAOs, the earlier you get on their books, the better off you are. Now, when you've identified your 3PAO, you really have to understand whether you're going to be doing a readiness or a full assessment. Now, a readiness assessment is great for an organization that does not have a sponsor agency, right? A readiness assessment is a subset of controls in that readiness assessment report that I had mentioned to download and go over earlier. And they'll come in and they'll assess you against those controls, and that'll really help you determine how ready you are. More importantly, if you successfully complete a readiness assessment, you'll get on the FedRAMP marketplace, and that will get your sales team pretty much a hunting license to go out to these agencies and say, hey, we're ready. We just need you to sponsor us. There's a high likelihood that we're going to achieve this, right? A readiness assessment takes anywhere between 4 and 6 months to complete by the 3PAO. Depending on when you get into FedRAMP's queue, their review queue keeps growing. A lot of CSPs are submitting for FedRAMP. So it could take several months for them to even review and give you feedback on the readiness assessment. So keep that in mind. Now, there are other advantages to a readiness assessment, right? For a CSP, they're going to get a report on how ready they actually are to undergo a FedRAMP full assessment, and it's a fraction of the cost, right? Some CSPs choose to do that whether they have a sponsor or not, right? They don't want to start the full assessment and incur the full cost of a full assessment until they've done a readiness assessment. That's rare, but I've seen some CSPs do that. I've seen some agencies say, we want to sponsor you, but we want to make sure you're ready first, so go do a readiness assessment. So that's one of the benefits for a CSP. Another main benefit for the agency is they're going to be applying resources to review the package and work with the CSP as well, right? And so a lot of CSPs are hesitant to sponsor because they don't want to apply the resources and dedicate resources to working with the CSP if they may not get a full ATO because they were unable and they weren't ready for an assessment, right? Now, when you approach a full assessment, it is important to know that it is a lot of work, right? It typically takes anywhere between 10 and 16 weeks. We've recently completed an assessment that took the CSP 5 months. And the reason being is it is a lot of artifacts to collect. You, as a CSP, need to have resources available to conduct those interviews. There are going to be follow-up requests. It is a lot of work to get a full assessment completed. So it's really important that you're prepared for the assessment and you know what artifacts you're going to need to collect, et cetera. As a part of the full assessment, you're going to have to do a penetration test. So there are 6 different attack vectors. Not all of them may apply, but just know that there is a thorough pen test that your 3PAO is going to execute and conduct on your offering. Now, new to the moderate and high baseline for revision 5 is a red team penetration testing exercise. The FedRAMP PMO recently put out draft guidance on the penetration testing exercise. I'm really looking forward to seeing the final guidance, but depending on what comes out as the final guidance, will really determine what needs to happen during these red team penetration testing exercises. So just be ready for that. Now, really important is that a CSP should be ready to take any corrective actions that they need to take. Findings in an assessment, whether it be a readiness assessment, whether it be a full assessment, whether you have an advisory firm or not, findings are going to be inevitable, right? It's, are you able to correct those findings? You're not going to be able to correct all of them, but you're going to have to correct some of them because they're high or critical findings. You're going to want to correct some of them because they're low-hanging fruit. Your engineering team, your team that manages the documentation and the processes should really be ready to address those corrective actions and provide the evidence that you've corrected those items to your 3PAO. Same for the penetration test. Hopefully your 3PAO is allowing you to have those findings retested. When you do have penetration test findings, you may not fix all of them, but there may be some that you want fixed and you want the report updated. So it's important that you are ready to take corrective actions. Moving on to the next phase, so authorizing the information system. When you complete your assessment, it's time for your package to be submitted. And first, it's going to be submitted to your agency sponsor. Now, your agency sponsor is going to review everything, right? Some of the key things they're going to be looking at really is a security assessment report, which tells them, what risks were identified as a part of the assessment. They really want to understand what the risk posture is and how much risk your system poses to their data and to their organization. And every organization and every agency does this a little bit differently, but most agencies want to make sure they understand their customer responsibilities so that they can put a plan in place to address any controls that the SSP says is their responsibility and has been validated as a part of their responsibility. And then they're going to want to check to see if all the documentation aligns. They'll have some questions about some of the descriptions and things like that as well. So it's really important that your documentation be clear, concise, and have all the information that they need so that they can quickly do their review. Now, based on our experience, agency reviews take anywhere between 2 and 4 months. It's a lot of documentation to go through. They have, there's resource constraints, so it can take a little bit of time for them to make their way through all of your documentation. So you got to be patient there. Hopefully at this point, they reviewed all your documentation. They're ready to give you an ATO. They sign the letter, and now your package makes its way over to the FedRAMP PMO. Now, the FedRAMP PMO is going to review everything, right? Where they're going to start, though, is going to be on those boundary diagrams that we talked about, on the system descriptions, right? And you'll find that they have a lot of comments and feedback in those areas, right? And if you think about it, all this data is coming to them all at once. They're not as intimate with the system as the CSP is, as the 3PAO is, as an advisory firm is, right? So they want to make sure everything is clear, not just so that they can make sure they do a good job reviewing the assessment and all the other documentation, but also for future agencies that are going to pick up the package and review everything as well, right? They want to make sure that when an agency looks at it, they're not going to have any questions and be confused about what they're reading. They want to make sure everything is very clear and very concise. They're going to review the assessment thoroughly. They're going to review the customer responsibilities. They're going to look over everything to make sure everything aligns. Now, the FedRAMP PMO, their current queue to review a package is about 5 to 6 months. So from the day you submit to the PMO for their review, it is going to take 5 to 6 months just for them to start the review. And that's today, right? There's over 450 CSPs that are currently on the marketplace. So they have to review all of their annual assessments. They have initial assessments that they're reviewing, readiness assessments that they're reviewing. They're, meeting with industry. They're meeting with agencies. And so they've got a lot on their plate. So it is quite a bit of time for them to start the review as of today, at least. So once they do the review, they're going to send feedback. Documentation is going to need to be updated. There's going to inevitably be things that you're going to need to change. Just be prepared to make the appropriate changes and provide the appropriate clarification. There might be a few controls that they want tested differently, et cetera. Just be prepared to go through that process. At this point, hopefully, they've agreed to everything. You've made the appropriate changes, and you are now on the marketplace. Once you get on the marketplace, you're going to move to continuous monitoring. Really important here. Your continuous monitoring program, your continuous monitoring requirements do not start at this phase. They started after you've implemented the security controls when we drew that line in the sand, right? A lot of CSPs think, yeah, I'll keep running my scans on a monthly basis and I'll keep doing all of these things that I'm supposed to be doing right after I get an ATO. But that's not how that works, right? Because the next time you get assessed, the previous 12 months are all fair game for your 3PAO to sample from. So you have to be implementing those controls even as you're being assessed, even as the package is being reviewed, until you get to that continuous monitoring phase where you're going to continue to execute that continuous monitoring program. Now, the continuous monitoring program includes things like, monthly vulnerability scans, reviewing access, reviewing audit logs for suspicious and inappropriate activities, and just anything that you're supposed to be doing on a weekly, monthly, annual, semi-annual basis, et cetera. So you have to be sure that you have a certain level of governance in place to make sure that you guys are executing this thing appropriately. Also, as a part of continuous monitoring, there's going to be ongoing annual assessments, right? So make sure, again, timelines and the queues of these 3 PAOs, they continue to grow. Make sure you get that conversation in place with them shortly after you get on that FedRAMP marketplace. And really, you should consider having that conversation with them right after your agency gives you an ATO. Because although you might not be on the marketplace for another 6 to 8 months, your agency might want you to have another assessment done within 12 months of them granting you an ATO. So the sooner you have that conversation with your 3 PAO, the better. Sure.
So, gone through the FedRAMP process, and now the FedRAMP marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're saying that another agency might still want to review before they accept.
So your agency is going to give you an ATO. That ATO goes to the FedRAMP marketplace. The FedRAMP marketplace does their review to make sure everything aligns and everything's good to go, and they give you an ATO, right? Now, that ATO can be reused by any agency they want, right? But what I was trying to say was you have annual assessment requirements that you still have to do, 1/3 of the controls, right? So it's important to have conversations with your 3 PAO early, shortly after your agency sponsor gave you that ATO, to make sure that you scheduled the annual assessments. Yep. So you're going to have ongoing reporting requirements. There are monthly reports that you have to develop and put in place, executive summaries, et cetera. So you have to make sure you're filing those appropriately. And then, of course, you just have your ongoing security activities that that you have to execute as well, monitoring the environment, et cetera.
And it's also important to note that this SP 800-137 is a good guide for continuous monitoring, but it's not a complete continuous monitoring. So if you have like a compensating control that you added in to maybe like offset needing automation somewhere, and you now have a manual process, well, now that manual process, you need to be able to prove that you're able to do it on a continuous basis. So
Exactly. Yep. All right. Any questions?
When Shante was sitting up there, she said that, there's when Shante was sitting up there, she was talking about different flavors of controls, right?
Yep.
What do you guys see from a different level of control across the federal landscape? So CMS has, probably inherits a lot of requirements from HHS. Maybe they have a little different flavor than a IRS or a Treasury versus a USDA. Certainly DOD has, even stricter controls in some areas. Do you see a lot of agencies after you get that FedRAMP ATO saying, great, you've got FedRAMP ATO, I still need you to do this, this, and this?
There have been situations where, that has happened. And really, it's a negotiation at that point between the CSP and that agency, right? If it's something that the CSP can't do for whatever reason, if you bring that to the agency and you tell them why the situation is that you can't implement that control, usually they're very understanding of that. There may be other things that you can do, but it's really a negotiation at that point. So yeah, it's very possible that your sponsor agency was fine with just FedRAMP moderate, let's say, but 5 years from now, an agency that wants to use your product comes in and says, hey, well, I want to add these 3 things, right? Typically, as an advisor, I typically tell a CSP, if it's something you can do and it's going to close the deal, more likely than not, you just want to do it, right? If it's too cumbersome and it just doesn't make sense, then bringing that information to that potential customer will really go a long way, and likely they'll understand as well, and they'll be fine with it. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Hi, I just want to make sure I really understand what you've been saying.
Sure.
So you've been using the term CSP.
Mhm.
And the way I use the term CSP is it's a cloud service provider. It is Google, AWS, Oracle, right? Azure. How are you using that term right now? Does it apply to all companies that could go through the ATO process? Like, I just want to make sure I'm not mistranslating everything you've communicated today.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, a cloud service is defined by NIST 800-145. There are 5 characteristics. If you go through those characteristics and your system meets those requirements, then you are a cloud service provider as an organization, right? So
Could you make that citation again?
NIST 800-145.
800-145.
Correct.
Got it.
Now you could be a SaaS solution, right? So you're sitting on top of those, infrastructures. You can be infrastructure as a service, and you can be platform as a service. So anybody who's going to be providing any cloud service offering to the federal agency is a CSP in this case, a cloud service provider in this case.
That is, just for reference, I've been working with a lot of startups. That in and of itself is completely mistranslated
Yep.
between newer technology companies and what you're talking about today. And it's going to cause a ton of confusion as they're like, well, you're just talking about something that applies to CSPs. It doesn't apply to me as a company, and it absolutely does. So I just want to make that point because this is so important to any new entrants that are Gen AI or whatever the government's trying to look to adopt.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And early on, a lot of agencies struggled with how to define a cloud. They didn't know what a cloud was, right? And that's why NIST came out with 800-145. There's another special publication that they came out to further clarify as well. I don't remember the number off the top of my head.
These
But yeah.
companies are not reading NIST publications.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to really find another business that you can work with that has the expertise in this area, right? Or at least bring on the resources that have that expertise.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? All right, I will take that as a no. Thank you for joining, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.